Greetings to my fellow writers who are presenting, including Christian, whom I know slightly from having taught with her years ago in an Orion workshop. Neither of us remembers exactly how many years ago, but it was a long time. And also greetings to the artists and writers and readers and lovers of books and art who are tuned in today. I'm going to talk about this book, as Lise said, The Way of Imagination. It was published this past August by Counterpoint Press in Berkeley. It's essays. When I was in high school, the word essay did not inspire excitement in me. The essays we were assigned to read tended to have abstract subjects like patriotism or love. And they were written by white-bearded old white guys for the most part, which of course I have become. I've been a white guy for a long time, but I've only become white-bearded in recent years. And they tended to be very abstract, those essays, and impersonal. And they made pronouncements about reality or some aspect of reality. Well, that's not the kind of essay I write. It wasn't until I was in college and then reading people like James Baldwin and many other fine modern essayists that I realized the essay didn't have to be abstract, it didn't have to be impersonal, and it didn't have to deliver wisdom. In fact, an essay could be a search for, if not wisdom, at least deeper understanding and deeper insight. And those are the kinds of essays that I write. My essays are driven by questions. They're driven by my ignorance and my desire to know something more than I presently know, or to see something more clearly than I presently see it. So for me, the essay is a form of inquiry, as I imagine most poems are for the poet. The poet starts a poem without knowing where it's going to end, and it may go through many revisions before the poet finally either finishes it or gives up on it and just says, this is what it is. And I think most fiction, and I write fiction as well, novels and short stories, I think most fiction is a kind of inquiry as well. It's not a filling out of a preconceived picture, like coloring in the shapes in a coloring book. That's not what good art is. Good art is a pursuit of a question, of a color, of a tone, of a voice, to see where it leads, or a question and see where that leads. So the first sentence in The Way of Imagination is a short one. It is, we are in trouble. And by we, I mean all of us, rich people, poor people, white people, brown-skinned, other-skinned people, men, women, strangers, friends, and all other species. We are collectively in trouble. Now, that's not news to anybody watching or listening right now. And we are in all kinds of trouble. We are in trouble because we have destabilized our climate. We have dramatically reduced biodiversity and the populations of our fellow species. We have accelerated the rates of extinction of other species. We have polluted the oceans, the rivers. We've eroded topsoil. We've divided into religious tribes, political tribes, racial, ethnic, economic tribes. And by tribes, I mean the sort of group that's held together by identifying who doesn't belong. So the tribe is a division between us, to whom we owe a certain kind of respect and responsibility, and them, which might be people who live elsewhere, worship a different God or no God, are either rich or poor, white-skinned, dark-skinned, male, female, straight, gay, all these ways that we divide ourselves up. So the troubles that we're in are both ecological and social. And both of those kinds of troubles are rooted in a spiritual failure. And in fact, they're fundamentally connected. That is, our abuse of the earth and our abuse of one another through neglect or through hostility or through contempt or through violence. Both forms of damage, both forms of assault on the earth and on one another have the same root. And the root is a failure of imagination. So this whole book is about imagination, and I'm going to give a few examples that I talk about in the book. And I'll read a few short passages and one slightly longer passage from the book to give you a little flavor of it. Imagination is the capacity to envision something that is not present to our senses, to envision a possibility that isn't actually in front of us. We take in the world constantly through our senses. If we were limited to what we see and what we hear and touch and feel, if that was all that ever entered our minds or rose in our minds, was what our direct sensory experience, virtually every invention that humans have come up with would not exist. Virtually every social reform that humans have come up with would not have come to pass. Until around 1800 or so, slavery was almost universal among human cultures. It wasn't only Europeans who bought and sold slaves. Africans bought and sold slaves. Native Americans and many tribes had slaves. The Romans and Greeks routinely took slaves whenever they beat up on or conquered a neighboring people. So slavery was a commonplace. It was the way of the world. It's assumed in the Bible. It's just because people are given instructions about how to treat their slaves, not how to free them, but just how to treat them. The existence of slavery was assumed in our Constitution. Provisions were made for it, that it was just in the world. Maybe some people were uncomfortable with it. Theoretically, Jefferson, for example, felt it was wrong, but he would have given up all his wealth if he had freed his slaves. So slavery was simply a fact, and a pretty widespread fact. Before slavery could be ended or challenged, somebody or some buddies had to imagine a world without slavery. The abolitionist movement grew very slowly from a few isolated voices in the 18th century until by the eve of the American Civil War, there were millions of Americans who had come to see slavery as an unacceptable, evil practice. But that had to be imagined first. Similarly, when women first began to speak in public in the early 19th century in the United States, they were virtually all Quaker women for a generation, because the Quakers in the 17th century, following George Fox in England, believed that all humans, old, young, male, female, all humans had potential insight into the deepest truth, what they call the light within. So that in a Quaker meeting, a woman could stand up and speak the words that she was moved, she felt called to say, just as well as a man could. And a child could do that just as well as an adult could. That was a radical idea. that idea that without regard to race, without regard to gender or sex, or without regard to age, all humans had potentially had access to the deepest truths about existence. And therefore, there was a whole tradition of Quaker women who became public speakers. They would speak in their meetings, but they could also speak in public. So when the abolitionist movement began, the only women who spoke for about a generation were Quaker women because of that tradition. But frequently when they spoke, when women spoke, in the front row would be a bunch of male ministers dressed in black, like this, insulted by the fact that a woman was standing up front behind a podium or on a stage and holding forth to an audience. Because in their view, women had no right whatsoever to speak. Women were emotional, irrational creatures. And they weren't alone in thinking that. Many women thought that because they had grown up in a culture that said that of women. So before women's rights could be fought for, they had to be imagined. And there was a whole cluster of amazing women in mid-19th century, the United States. Parallel movements were happening elsewhere, but I'm really focusing on my country. It's the ones whose history I know best. A whole cluster of women began saying, women deserve exactly the same rights as men. Now, we haven't realized that fully, just as we haven't eradicated the effects of slavery. I understand that. But we have made a great deal of progress in liberating ourselves from the legacy of slavery. Similarly, we have made a great deal of progress in assuring equal rights to females in this country, to the rights that males enjoy, privileges and rights that males enjoy. I understand it's not perfect. We still have a long way to go. But when it was first proposed that women should be allowed to own property, that women should be allowed to sue for divorce, that when they divorced, women had a presumptive right to access to their children. In 1850, 1860, 1880, none of those things was true. Women couldn't own property. Women couldn't sue for divorce, only the males could. And when there was a divorce, the husband had presumptive ownership, access to the children, not the wife. And forget about voting. When it was first proposed that women should be allowed to vote, there were men who said, is it going to be dogs next voting? This is ridiculous, women voting. It was just unimaginable. Well, it was imaginable. And there was a group of women, and gradually joined by a few supportive men, who imagined it. And that included Black men, as well as white men, and Black women, as well as white women. And so the suffragist movement eventually won the right to vote for women in the United States. It took on the order of 65 to 70 years from when that movement started in the mid-19th century. That's how much resistance there was to it and how unobvious it was. Underlying both the opposition to slavery and the call for equal rights for women, underlying that is something else that had to be imagined. And that is the idea of human equality. If you look around the world, do you see human equality? Are all people equally tall or short, or rich or poor, or smart, or dumb, or handsome, or ugly? Is there any way in which your senses tell you by looking at humans that we're equal? Well, if you come up with a way of answering yes to that, let me know about it. because humans differ by every measure: energy, laziness, insight, blindness. The idea that humans somehow, at some level, were created equal, it's right there in the Declaration. That's an imagined idea. It's imagined. And because we can imagine a world in which all humans are given equal respect, equal opportunity, equal protection, because we can imagine that, we can work towards it. Again, we have a long way to go. And there are forces that are constantly trying to curb voting rights, for example, and many other kinds of rights. So the underlying reality behind the abolition of slavery, the opposition to slavery at least, the call for equal rights for women, including the right to vote, more recently, equal rights for people regardless of their sexual orientation. That's still an idea. It's so new. It's so new as an idea that the forces lined up against it are still very powerful. But it had to be imagined that it has to be imagined that there are not only two ways of being a sexual creature. And we're still in the throes of that. Race is a biological fiction. There is no such thing. It's a social invention. And the overcoming of race, or racism rather, has to be a social invention, has to be a imagined social achievement. So the fundamental reforms in society have arisen from the work of imagination that could envision something that was not visible in the world. Similarly, conservation, restoration, the protection of other species is not something we do instinctively. It's something we have to learn to do. The point is often made, with justice, that indigenous peoples the world over have implicit, they don't use the word ecology, but they have implicit in their belief system and their practices an honoring of the earth and its bounty and its processes, what we might call it ecological wisdom. That wouldn't be the terms they'd use. And it's true. It's true of the indigenous cultures that have survived, because a culture that does not have ecological wisdom, however they achieve it, perishes. And the world, in fact, is littered with failed indigenous peoples, the ruins of cultures that never came to terms with natural limits, that never understood the requirement of respecting the sources of their food and water and nourishment and shelter and fiber and medicines. So those are also those practices, ecologically wise practices, whether in an indigenous culture or right today in the United States of America, ecologically wise practices. Those are practices that have to be imagined, because our instinct is to grab the stuff we want, as much of it as possible, to hoard it, to use it up. That's what our biology drives us to do. But imagination can break out of the enclosure that biology may impose on us and help us to envision a way of living that enables us to live in harmony with natural systems and with other species. So both social reform the search for a peaceful and loving and sustainable way of life together with one another as humans, that search, and the search for a way of living in harmony with the natural systems of the earth and our fellow species. That's the same search. And both of those searches, or that one united search, requires the work of imagination. Well, the book gives quite a few examples of imagination in operation. It starts with a simple example. Anybody who's been around a young child, whether your own child or younger sibling or grandchild. I've had the great good luck to have the experience both with my own children and my grandchildren, and occasionally with other kids. You take a toddler. So I sit, one of my granddaughters, when she was little, she's no longer little, but when she was little, I'm babysitting her. And we're sitting out in the sunny side room of our daughter's house, and I'm there with her daughter. And we're doing make-believe stuff. And I get a little wooden car, and I put it on my head. And I say to the little girl, her name's Eva, I say, Eva, you like my hat? And she looks up and she says, car. I say, no, it's a hat. And she's, no, not persuaded. Car, she says. I say, okay, put it down. About 2 weeks later, we're playing. I do the same thing, put the car up there. I say, you like my hat? She goes, hat. She had made that leap. It's a leap that is so amazing, but also so commonplace that we don't recognize that it's a superpower. She could turn that car into a hat. And it's a work of imagination that does that. Just as she can imagine an elephant flying across the room we were sitting in, eating spaghetti. And you can too, as I say that. If it weren't so commonplace, that power to envision something that's actually not present to us, we would recognize it as a superpower, and it is. Now, mind you, imagination can be used for destructive purposes. The assault on the US Capitol in January was elaborately imagined by a cluster of people who armed themselves to do what they did. It was imagined ahead of time. Every building that's constructed has to be imagined before it's built, whether or not it has blueprints. It has to be imagined before it's built. Every new tool, every book, every poem, every sentence that one is composing has to be imagined before it's made. So imagination is a neutral power. It is not inevitably benign. Hackers use imagination to figure out how to get around the various defenses that we have against hacking. Military planners use imagination to figure out how to kill people more efficiently and effectively. Bank robbers imagine how to pull off their heist. So imagination is not an inevitably benign power, but it can be. It's the power actually that got us into the trouble we're in right now, or at least it's part of the reason. All the technology that has enabled us, first of all, to multiply our population so dramatically. The technology that we use to produce all that plastic that's now, much of which is now floating in the ocean, to mine, burn, and harness fossil fuel energy, to make nuclear weapons. Those are all works of the imagination. The human population has grown dramatically in my lifetime because of modern medicine. Because in the 19th century, if you had 5 children, you could expect 2 or 3 of them to die. Today, if you have 5 children, as many cultures that were having 5 children in the 19th century are still doing, it's highly likely that all 5 will live to adulthood and reproduce. That's the result of medicine, including better hygiene, clean water to drink, for example. And none of us would want to do away with or do without either clean water or modern medicine. But in my lifetime, I was born in 1945, the human population has increased from 2.3 billion to 7.8 billion today. That's more than triple in my lifetime, and I'm 75 years old. So that's 2 generations. In 2 generations, we have tripled, more than tripled our population. And that's the result of the work of human imagination. All those medical discoveries, all those increased understanding of what causes certain kinds of disease, the development of vaccines against smallpox. Smallpox used to kill many children worldwide, including in this country. And now nobody dies of smallpox. And again, we're glad of that. But we have to understand that the same powers that got us into this trouble, that swelled, enabled our population to swell, that enabled us to disrupt the climate. Nobody woke up in the morning thinking, what can I do to disrupt the climate? Even the CEO of Exxon, who frankly, I think is that CEO and a lot of other fossil fuel company CEOs are doing evil things. I don't think they're evil people, but they are doing evil things. But they don't wake up thinking, how can I disrupt the Earth's climate? They wake up to think, how can I protect my profit margin and my share price and the value of all the shares that I've accumulated as CEO of Exxon or whatever oil company you want to pick. Similarly, our imagination has gotten us into the many divisions that besiege our society and societies around the world. Again, I said, race is a biological fiction. It's not, there's no biological race. There's one, we are a species worldwide. And the difference between me with my light, rosy, old Irish skin, wrinkled Irish skin, and the darkest skinned African, the genetic difference between the two of us is vanishingly minuscule. And it's less than the difference between me and my wife, who's also a rosy skinned person with a lot of Irish in her background. So race is not a biological reality. It's an imagined reality. And because it's imagined and represented in films, old books, old theologies, because it's imagined, it can be unimagined. Because imagination helped us to develop the science, the technology, the industries that have disrupted global natural patterns and reduced biodiversity. Because all of that is the fruit of the American imagination. It can be undone. We can find solutions to it. Imagination got us into the trouble we're in, and it can get us out. Well, let me put it slightly more cautiously. If anything is going to get us out, it's going to require acts of imagination. So here's an example. Some years ago, and there's a chapter on this in the book, I was giving a speech at a university in Chicago, and they had a dinner for me afterwards. And a man who was on the board of this university asked to be seated beside me at the dinner. Very well-dressed man. He introduced himself as a retired banker from Chicago, who in a very polite way said he made just an obscene amount of money. And he had an obscene amount of money. He had provided for his family. He had provided for his own, probably not too lengthy future, given his age. That was his view. And he had decided to invest the rest of it in future old growth forests. And I said to him, what's a future old growth forest? What do you mean? He said, well, I've been consulting with forest ecologists about land here in Illinois, where he lived, and also in some other Midwestern states, land that was once richly forested and was cut over for farming or just clear cut for timbering. And that has been just allowed to go back to saplings and so forth. So I've been buying up land because that these forest ecologists advise me is superbly suited for growing hardwood forests, which this man loved. And he said, and now we're planting them with trees, taking into account global warming, which means that species that formerly would only grow way south of Illinois and Ohio and Indiana will now grow up here. So they were planting these forests. And he said in about 200 years, children will be able to go through those forests and look around and get some feeling for what much of America was in 1800, before clearings and wholesale settlement by light-skinned people like me started transforming the landscape. So I said, well, that sounds like a wonderful project. You must have spent a lot of time in the forest as a boy. He said, no, actually, I grew up in downtown Chicago and I never went to a forest. I said, well, you must have visited old growth forests. He said, well, I have since I started this project. After I started the project, the forest ecologists have taken me. There are a few little pockets. You can find a few in my home state of Indiana, for example. Little 50-acre pockets of old growth forest, never cut. I said, well, where did your idea come from? He said, it came from reading James Fenimore Cooper's Leather Stocking Tales novels when I was a kid. You may never have read those novels, but it's about a man named, a frontiersman named Leather Stocking, and there are Native Americans in it, and there's all kinds of racial stereotypes in there. It's not very politically correct now in its treatment of Indians, but it did realize that Native people had tremendous knowledge of the landscape, that white people were coming in and just chopping trees down and so forth. But it also has lots of scenes. Those novels, the Leather Stocking Tales by James Fenimore Cooper, had lots of scenes in which Leather Stocking, the character, is going through primordial forests. And he said, so I got this image in my mind as a boy of these primordial forests with the big, huge trees and deep shade and ferns and lots of wildlife. And he said, that's what I want to recreate. And I want children 200 years from now to be able to not only read those novels, or even if they don't read those novels, to go through these woods and get a little feel for that forest. So after I came home from that trip, I started thinking about the steps that man had to go through, the imaginative leaps he had to make. First of all, he had to have a picture in his head that came from books. Now, as a writer of books, and especially a writer of fiction, I loved the idea that his image of an old growth forest came from print on a page. It didn't come from the school tour. It didn't come from a movie or a photograph, a big calendar picture. It came from words on a page. That is an astounding leap. Now, we make it all the time. Everybody who's listening and watching right now can read. And we forget that reading is just little black marks on a page, isn't it? That's all it is. A 5-year-old, when she first begins to see that those little squiggly black marks are letters and then words, and then pictures and their stories. That's breathtakingly magical to a 5-year-old or a 4-year-old, which is when my sister taught me to read. Where even if you're not an old codger like me, you've been reading long enough that you've forgotten probably how miraculous it is that those little black marks on a piece of paper can transport us to other people, can help a male gain some insight into a female character, or a young reader get some insight into an old character. Or somebody living today could get a little feel of what it might have been like to live in the Middle Ages. And all that from little black marks on pieces of paper. Well, that's how this man had gotten his idea of old growth forests. So that was one leap he had to make. The second leap he had to make was to realize that if he was going to recreate them or finance the recreating, he wouldn't do the recreating, to finance it, he had to find out somebody who knew something about forests. And where do you go? You go to somebody who studies forests. You don't just go to somebody who cuts them down, because you don't actually have to know. There are people who harvest timber who know a great deal about trees and love trees and are very, very responsible ecologically. But most people who cut down trees aren't. They're just cutting down trees because they're profitable stuff to cut down and sell. So you need to find somebody who studies the ecology of forests. What is a healthy forest? And what soils and temperatures and weather patterns are ideal for growing hardwood forests. So he had to make that leap to science. He didn't have any background in science. He followed financial economics and accounting and so forth. But then the biggest leap he had to make was to think about children 200 or 300 years in the future walking through those woods. Those kids won't have ever heard of him. They're not going to light a candle in his memory. They're not going to put up a little plaque to honor him. Those kids are total strangers. But he had the ability to imagine the delight they could take in walking through an old growth forest. Now, that last step is one we all have to make. And that's not just to think about future children or future people of any age walking through an old growth forest, although I like to think about that. We need to think about the next generation and generations after that, and after that, and after that, future generations living on a habitable planet, a planet that is at least as habitable as it is right this minute. And ideally that is more habitable, by which I mean in which greenhouse emissions have begun to come down rather than keep going up, in which species biodiversity increases rather than decreases, in which there's more habitat for our fellow species, meaning more parks, more protected areas in the oceans and on land as well, in which we are able to grow our food without destroying more habitat, without taking more habitat from other species. So to have a moral responsibility towards future generations, to feel that, requires imagination. We're going to need science, the best science, just as we have needed the best science in addressing the pandemic. We're going to need imagination to figure out ways of living in greater harmony with one another, with our neighbors, our literal close by neighbors, and also our further afield neighbors, the people who live across town or in a different neighborhood, who live in a different country. And in order to live in greater harmony with one another, we have to more richly imagine what life is like for one another. It's only possible to hate someone if you're completely ignorant of what they're experiencing. We all suffer. It's inherent in existence. We all fall sick. We all have disappointments. We all outlive certain people we love, certain pets we love, certain institutions we love. You can only hate another person if you have not made the imaginative effort to enter his or her life. We can't know fully, entirely, perfectly what another person is experiencing, but imagination can carry us a good way towards that understanding. Again, I'll come back to the role of art. You will have heard from politicians, often from school officials, that we need more STEM, the acronym STEM, which stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Huge emphasis on that. It's present, it's true in my community, and I know it's true across the country, and it's happening in other countries. As though we are short of technology, as though we don't have enough engineers or scientists. I'm all for science and engineering. I studied physics and math as an undergraduate. I love science, but we are not short of technology. We are not short of engineering or science. What we're short of is wisdom. What we're short of is ethics. We don't lack tools. We lack the wisdom to know what tools to use, whether to use them or not. And the tools can include genetic modification. It can include the dynamite that's used to blow the tops off mountains in West Virginia to get cheap coal. We're not short of technical knowledge. Sure, let's keep getting more technical knowledge. I'm not opposed to that. But that's not what we lack. What we lack is a set of values, a set of understandings, and the wisdom, both as individuals and collectively, to use the technology that we already have in a wise and responsible way, a way that will not diminish the world, a way that will not harm other species and will not harm our fellow human beings. And imagination is at the root of that seeking of wisdom. And art is the primary way that we humans embody, express, and share our values. And by art, I mean not only visual arts, although I certainly include that, but film and music, novels, short stories, essays, poems, all the ways in which we, as humans, use different media, musical notes, pigments, words, numerical symbols. We use different media to express our understanding of what it means to be human, of what our own lives are like or the lives of other people are like. So we need the acronym to not be just STEM, S-T-E-M. We need an A in there, make it STEAM. And by arts, I include the humanities, at least for this purpose. We need history. We need philosophy. We need religious studies or the study of spiritual traditions. We need indigenous knowledge from our own indigenous peoples in this continent and from other continents as well. And none of those fit in STEM. So imagination is the way in which, through the arts, we can come to know ourselves better. And more importantly, we can come to know people who are outwardly, in some manner, different from us. by race, by color, skin color, not by race, by skin color, by gender, by sexual orientation, by ethnicity, nationality, all those ways that humans divide one another can transcend those seeming divisions.
So we have 15 minutes left in the session, and I know there's a lot of questions.
Okay, I'm ready to take questions. I didn't
Not-
read a word to you, even though I said I would. I've got a lot of selections here, but I had more than too much to say maybe, but I'm happy to entertain questions now. Should I look at them or do you want to look at them?
I'd like to invite the panelists have been chatting away and have some
Sure.
thoughts that they would like to speak and ask about. So I thought, we'd give them a chance first.
Okay.
Thank you. Sherry, would you like to go first?
Thank you, Liz and Scott. This is giving us an opportunity to address some things that I think are really important. I like to think about people and where they are in terms of time of day. And so there are some people that have just woken up and some people that have been, toiling the whole day through. And so as you were talking, I believe I heard you say that you recently woke up to the fact of your whiteness. And I think that some of that became very apparent in some of the things that you were saying. And I want to share this one piece because I think it's relevant to this discussion. That I just wrote a chapter for Rob Shetterly's book on Americans Who Tell the Truth that says, at the opening, the last 400 years of racial science have proven one thing, that dividing human beings into racial categories has no basis in science. It is nothing more than white confirmation bias dissembling as science. And so, despite its lack of legitimacy, I think we can all agree that this science has been effectively used to influence the social, political, economic, and cultural discourse that has shaped our most exclusionary societies, which are all based in colonization. And so one of the things that was cringeworthy for me, almost made me disconnect, was your use of the word tribe and tribes. And then your need to explain. And I think that that's a really good barometer for us. That if we need to explain why we're using a word in the way that we're using it, then we probably shouldn't be using it. And so we have this whole history of tribes and tribal being used to denote savagery, brutality, dissension into chaos and madness. You hear politicians all the time saying they went tribal. This descended into tribalism. However, indigenous peoples here and in other continents have been labeled as tribes and tribal. We are referred to with legal and political terminology as tribes here in the United States. And so by you using that term and then saying, but let me explain how I'm using it, and then you go into the negative connotation of the word tribes and tribal, what you're doing is you're perpetuating an association of negativity and savagery and dehumanization to peoples who are readily, legally, and politically and socially referred to as tribes. And so, I mean, that's just something that is a very painful thing for me to have to hear over and over again. And it's every time I hear it, it's coming out of the mouth of a white man, unless it's a trendy young woman who's saying, this is I formed my tribe, right? And so it's something that's able to be used interchangeably by white population, but it's something that always is attached to, certain ideas connected to conquest and genocide and erasure and invisibility and diminishment for indigenous peoples. And I just think that it's really important to be aware, because we all are dealing with words. We're all our art form is crafting words and understanding the power of those words and the influence that they have on other people. And the ways that we choose to use our words are important. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that we all know that race is a manufactured, illusory principle. However, I think it's important for us to also recognize the very real harm that has been done by those who have used racial science to diminish and to destroy other peoples, and how there's a resurgence right now in racial science. All of this DNA testing is connected to these ideas of separation. And so we have to also be aware of, we can't just go from, I recognize that I'm white, to race doesn't exist, because then we bypass all of the work that has to be done. And I just wanted to share those things, because I don't think it's your intention to come across the way that there was a lot of bristling that was going on. And I think that it has to do with the fact that you're a man who grew up in a world and we're prepared for a world that is disappearing before your eyes, and things are changing rapidly right now. And 30 years ago, you and I probably wouldn't have had this discussion. And so, I want to acknowledge that, but I also want to acknowledge that we have to be thoughtful about how we use words. So thank you for that opportunity, Liz.
I take your correction. And every time I use the word tribe or tribal, I could equally well and better have used in-group and out-group. That's the sociological definition. But I also feel, as I heard you speak, that you have stereotyped me as well. I understood my whiteness not recently. I didn't come to understand it recently. I came to understand it when I was 14 years old and first watched news coverage of police dogs in the South being sicked on Black school children simply trying to go to school. And I was bewildered when I would be taken to the South with my family to visit my father's relatives in Mississippi and see colored and white drinking fountains. I've known since I was a child that I'm white, and that all sorts of privileges and exceptions come from that. I've also understood, at least since I was an undergraduate, that my maleness entails all sorts of privilege. So just as I should have been more careful in using or choosing not to use the word tribe and tribal, and I take your correction on that, I think you should not look at somebody who looks like me and make assumptions about when or how thoroughly I came to understand something. As for, I think there was one thing you agreed with at the beginning, and I can't remember now what it was, because you spent so much time correcting me on tribe and tribalism. But I agree with that correction. You're right about that, that it's a word that is harmful, and I will avoid using it. I don't believe I use it in the book. I did use it in my talk. Are there other panelists who have something they'd like to say?
Yes, Xupeng Lin has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sitting with some discomfort about the way that you responded to Sherry's comment, so I just need to say that.
Mm-hmm.
The comment that I made in the chat was asking the question, for whom do you feel you can speak? And because you were using the pronoun we at various points throughout your talk, and speaking about artists and imagination. I'm an artist. I'm an artist and I'm an immigrant. And I'm an immigrant who comes from a colonized nation, Taiwan, that has been colonized for 400 years. And I acknowledge and have been doing work on being a settler on stolen land in this country. So I'm always very aware of the fact that artists are not a homogeneous group. And so I'm, you know, there are cultures, different cultures have different ways of thinking about art. And I'm kind of uncomfortable with the ways that you seem to kind of universalize the arts. And in your response to Sherry, I would hope that we could have a conversation about power, and not, you know, not necessarily about stereotypes, but a question about or discussion about who has the power to marginalize certain artists. I mean, you know, for decades, in the first few decades of my life, there were hardly any women that were acknowledged in the art world. So yeah, those were my thoughts.
Mhm.
I just had something, if I want to jump in here. This is Paul.
Well, okay.
No, that's okay. Let him go.
Oh, hi. Just as there's just not quite enough time, but I wanted to say I'm so glad that this conversation has started, because I thought earlier the same thing when people were telling stories, and I thought, well, what about the people who don't understand our stories? And what this has shown is, even among us, all of us who are in this book, we have so many different ways of looking at everything. I would hope we would have a chance to have more of this discussion, maybe tonight, or again, we set it up. So I won't take any more of your time to respond, but I'm glad the discussion is out there. I just wanted to say that. And I'm hoping that we can really start sharing among ourselves all these different insights that we get from who we are and what we're doing.
The word we, the pronoun we can blur many important distinctions. But the alternative pronouns are I and you. And the trouble is, if one, okay, there's the word we again, if one can't seek common ground with other human beings, then there is no conversation. And then there is no prospect that we will live in peace with one another. And there are many ways in which humans are we. That is, all of us are affecting the condition of the planet. If one gets on an airplane and flies, one is affecting the planet, regardless of whether one is a first generation immigrant or somebody who traces their ancestry back to the Mayflower. We shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that there is nothing that we share in common, that we are so different, that our conditions, our backgrounds, our particular forms of suffering or exclusion are so unique to ourselves that we have nothing in common with others. There's always a tension between overgeneralizing, which I know I have a tendency to do, but I also suspect that many people look at the face that's on the screen with its white beard and its pink skin and its obvious age and make assumptions about what that person does or doesn't understand that are just as marginalizing and stereotyping and limiting as any bias and prejudice that I may have. And I'm certain that I have biases and prejudices. I've been alive for 75 years, thinking and reading and meeting people, teaching students, trying to learn how to be a better human being. And I will die without having made a lot of progress. I hope I've made some progress. So it is way easier to see what's wrong with another person, what another person doesn't understand or doesn't feel or doesn't recognize, than it is to try to see what that other person might have in common with you. So if I have hurt feelings or reinforced sense of marginalization or disrespect on the part of anybody, either anybody who has spoken or maybe many people who haven't spoken, I regret that. And I'm always, I hope, always open to correction and to learning. But I do believe that humans have more in common fundamentally than the ways in which we differ from one another. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be a teacher and I wouldn't be a writer. I don't write just for people who are exactly like myself. I don't know who is exactly like myself. So we've run to the end of this time. I don't want to take the time from the next person, but thanks for the good questions and for the good comments.
Thank you, Scott. I think this is a good opportunity for us to read each other's work.